Welcome to Unit 3 of the Introduction to American Law. Unit 3 is all about tort law. When we look into tort law, we must ask the question, what is a tort? And really a tort is a wrongful act. This could be anything from someone lying about you to someone hitting you in the face or maybe running you over with their car. Any wrongful act committed against a person is considered a tort. There are two main categories of torts. There are individual torts and mass torts. An individual tort is simply a wrongful act committed by one person against one person, whereas a mass tort is a wrongful act committed by one person or one party against a number of people. So, for instance, if a drug manufacturer creates a dangerous drug and sells it on the market, that would be a mass tort, as opposed to if one person punches another person in the face, that would be an individual tort. So tort law in general is a process of adjudication of individual disputes, as well as addressing spectacularly large numbers of injuries as well. What this means is tort law can alleviate the suffering of individuals in disputes where maybe a person gets hit by a car, but then it can also address issues like the drug example I mentioned earlier. In the legal system, there is a necessity for tort law because without it, a few different things would happen. One would be that people would take less care in not injuring others, because tort law provides a process for individuals to be compensated when they get injured by other individuals. Without tort law, then there would be no incentive for people to not injure others. In addition to this, victims of accidents would be left to their own resources to deal with their injuries if tort law were not in existence. What this means is that without the process of compensation created by tort law, then victims would be stuck with their own money or their own insurance to solve problems that they might not be able to handle on their own. For instance, if an individual gets struck by a car and they need to go to the hospital, and they might spend months in the hospital because of this injury that may have been caused by a negligent driver, if that driver were on their phone. Without tort law to compensate that individual, then they would be left paying their own medical bills, and if they didn't have insurance, then likely they would not be able to do so. Finally, without tort law, people could unfairly inflict harm on others, whether it be purposefully or unintentionally. What that means is, without people needing to take care to not hurt others, it would open the door for people to inflict harm on others just because. There are alternatives to tort law for correcting wrongs, one of them being criminal prosecution, meaning if someone punches you in the face, yes, you could sue them for damages, but you could also prosecute them criminally, leading to jail sentences or probation, things like that. Another alternative to tort law would be excessive government regulation. For instance, if we didn't have tort law, then there would be nothing to hold companies back from putting dangerous products in the marketplace, aside from government regulation. However, without tort law, then these regulations would need to be excessive in order to protect the end consumer, meaning that the government might need to regulate every single step of the production process in order to make sure that companies are doing it safely. Another potential way to correct wrongs in the absence of tort law is the free market and reputation created by companies. For instance, if Coca-Cola were to develop a reputation of exploding bottles in people's hands or of finding poison in their Coke, then people would probably opt to avoid Coca-Cola when they have the choice in the marketplace. They would opt for Pepsi or another alternative. So the free market is another way to correct wrongs. And finally, when it comes to correcting wrongs in the absence of tort law, charity provides our last option. What this would look like is, say, an individual gets struck by a car and there's no tort law to compensate that individual. Charities would likely step in order to help that individual pay their medical bills. Tort law has a few different purposes. One of them being to deter people from committing bad actions. Like we mentioned earlier, without tort law, then individuals could harm others freely. So a purpose of tort law is to deter people from doing that. Another purpose is to provide incentives for people who commit good actions, meaning that if you're a company and you are watching all your competitors get sued for producing dangerous products and you are not producing dangerous products and you're not getting sued, then you might be sitting up in your boardroom with your CEO and the rest of your board smiling because all of your competitors are getting sued, but you're not because you're the good guys. Another purpose of tort law is to compensate individuals who are deserving of it, meaning if someone were to get struck by a car, then they would be deserving of compensation if the driver were negligent in, for instance, if they were on their phone and they struck the individual. And then finally, tort law is used to spread fairness throughout society. It only seems fair that if you punch an individual in the face, then you owe them something in return for causing them that harm. So tort law is a method for spreading fairness throughout society. Tort law has certain advantages over other legal systems. One being it allows the private citizens to take the lead as opposed to government or corporate entities. What this means is that in criminal prosecution, for instance, then the state starts the cases. If there is a homicide, then the state finds out and takes up the case in the courts against the suspected perpetrator. However, with tort law, this system can begin with private citizens like you or I. This is advantageous because there does not need to be any sort of formal police investigation into an issue in order for it to get started. So it's something much more accessible throughout society. Another advantage tort law has over other systems is that most of it's made up of pretty general rules instead of specific rules that are hard to understand. For instance, one general rule of tort law is that you should not try to do harm against another person. It's really vague, but it's really easy to understand as well. So it's easier for everyday people to understand the general principles behind tort law without having to study in depth tons and tons of statutes passed by legislatures. And finally, tort law instills deterrence and compensation policies into society by requiring the wrongdoers to pay the victims directly. What this means is that, for instance, in the criminal system, if someone wrongs someone else, then the wrongdoer could, for instance, go to prison for a number of years. In this case, the wrongdoer does not pay the victim directly. The wrongdoer goes to prison. However, in the tort law system, when someone wrongs another person, they would pay their victim directly in order to create that compensation. This is a way of spreading fairness and really deterring people from committing crimes in the first place. So, Unit 3, Lesson 1, the Introduction to Tort Law. We covered a little bit about what tort law is, what torts are, and why we need it, what the purposes behind tort law are, what would happen if we didn't have tort law, and in general, we were exposed to tort law for the first time, and we will discuss more about tort law in the future.